So we are now recording. I'm going to share my screen with you all. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so if you have a question, raise your hand in the participants chat because I can only see one very tiny square in the corner of my screen. We're going to stop every few slides to ask questions and in fact to get you all to give me some feedback. So feel free, right, to make sure you're engaged. Most of this is going to be based on what you all think and really considering things. I think we just got something in the good old chat box, but I can't pull up the chat. I'm not sure why. Okay, so there must not have been anything there if I can't pull it up. All right, so Theory 101. What is theory? So theory, while a lot of people make it out to be this kind of scary thing, the one thing you should think when you think about any and every argument in debate is that an argument is an argument. Okay? I learned this when I was in debate camp. I learned this when I started debating, and then it became even more true when I got to college. It's become even more true as a coach. An argument is an argument. There are no scary arguments. There are only arguments that you understand, that you don't understand. There are only arguments that you can answer and that you can't answer. And the only thing that separates those arguments is a little bit of hard work. An argument is an argument. So what is the function of this particular argument, right? And just a world, a galaxy of other arguments. So it establishes norms in debate. A lot of things we do in debate are based on rules. So the idea that there must be a judge, the idea that the affirmative gets 6 minutes to speak, the idea that cross-examination is 3 minutes. These are rules. Now, there are also norms. So a norm really in circuit debate is that although cross-examination officially ends at 3 minutes, most people will allow you to use your preparation time to continue asking questions. This is a norm. It is not a rule. You do not have to answer any questions at the end of the 3-minute mark. This is a norm. And another example is, right, in a business meeting, or maybe when you're meeting someone or you go to the home of another family for dinner, you might shake their hands. This is a specific American norm. There are places in the world where people don't shake hands, right? Now, especially post-COVID, there's going to be way less handshaking in the world, right? It is not a rule that if you go to dinner or you have a business meeting that you must shake someone's hand. It is a norm. So theory is about creating, establishing, and kind of navigating the norms of debate, not the rules. Now, what can you do with those norms? Once you have an idea of what norm you want to set or what norm you would like to invoke, you can call out things that you think are problematic. So if you could draw a circle and say all the things inside the circle are allowed and all the things outside the circle should be disallowed, that is functionally what theory is. It draws a circle around those things that you think are acceptable and excludes those things that you think are problematic. Theory is also a strategy to is part of a larger strategy in a debate to force your opponents to make choices. In a 1AR, for example, if your opponent does something you think is problematic that falls outside of the circle, you do not have to spend 4 minutes on a theory argument, right, to object to what they did. You can make a theory argument and also attempt to answer their arguments on the flow. You can force your opponent to spend time on the theory argument or to spend time on substance. But this is a choice they now must make. And they can create strategic errors. You can force an error in your opponent's strategy and in their execution by introducing right? A theory argument that correctly calls out problematic issues. And so now you have multiple strategies that you can execute in your 2AR to win the debate. Finally, the most important thing about what a theory argument is it is a forced choice for the judge. You are asking the judge to make a choice about what norms all of debate should follow. So theory is not just about the one round in which you are reading this argument. In your mind, when you say certain things should be outside of the circle, that means all of the things outside of the circle should always be, right? If we had a debate and this thing I say is problematic or outside of my circle goes away, you now have to say why that is good for all of debate, for all of time, for this practice to go away. So if the practice is actually really bad, it becomes really easy to say it should go away. If theory is used correctly, then you have really an easy fight. If you're using theory incorrectly and you don't really have a defense of why this practice should go away forever, then you have an uphill battle. Now you can still win, but of course it is going to be way harder. Does anyone have a question about what I've talked about so far?
I have one if no one else has one.
Okay.
Professor Smith, how in the way that people establish certain norms, what is it about the debate community that sort of pushes back? For example, like how we have decided what are the ways we should cut cards. We've decided that cutting cards is okay. We've like what are the norms and procedures that govern that sort of thing, and has theory arguments sort of affected that conversation in some meaningful way?
Theory arguments have definitely affected the way we do things like cut cards or what arguments that we read in debates, because as an argument becomes more popular, it shapes what people are willing to do. So there's certain classes of arguments that have been pushed out of debate because everyone in debate decided that we're going to call out this behavior that everyone thought was problematic. There are some more interesting examples about cards and theory that we will discuss in a couple of minutes. But definitely the way we cut cards and the cards that we read have definitely been affected by theory.
Thank you.
Can you re-explain what you mean by forcing your opponent to make choices?
So if you give a 1AR, so you've read an AF, your opponent reads a disad, you give a 1AR between the AF, comparing the AF and the disad. What does your opponent have to answer? Hannah?
When you're AF?
Yes, you are AF, your opponent reads a disad. You give a 1AR comparing the AF to the disad. What does your opponent have to answer?
The AF.
Okay, so now we introduce a theory argument that says they have done something that is problematic, and we extend the AF, and we answer the disad. What does your opponent have to answer?
All of them? Well, the AF and the theory?
Right, and they still have to extend their own argument. So
also just like a time suck, sort of?
Well, no, you should only call out things when they are actually problematic. Right? A time suck is an indicator of something you put out into the debate world or into a round just for the sake of it to make someone answer it. You should not just put out something into the debate world and into the debate round just to make them answer it, because they can also punish you for doing that. And so time sucks are things that we think just, steal our opponent's time, but we couldn't actually really win, or we don't think we could win. Remember, theory arguments should only be used when we think that we can actually win the debate on them, or when they are actually helpful to call out bad practices. So in this instance, right, between the disad, the affirmative, and the theory argument, we don't need to spend all 4 minutes, right, saying they did something bad. We can spend maybe 1 minute saying they did something wrong and 3 minutes engaging the rest of the debate. Now the 2NR has to make choices about how they want to spend their time. Do they spend just enough time, right? It's really a Goldilocks situation. If they overcover theory, right, even though you were correct, right, you can then make a choice. Was this something so egregious that you think it is worth going for at the end of the round? Or do you think, well, it's not worth going for, and I think I have a better chance of winning on substance? This is not a time suck, because it is not just something you put out there just to make them answer it, right? It's not just something, you know, you put on so the judge has something to write down, right? Theory arguments should only be used when you actually think they have a chance of winning the debate. An example of this is a team that I coached, a policy team, and I was not their primary coach. I would just help out with them in terms of, you know, critical arguments. They used to read 11 or 12 off. 8 or so of those off-case arguments would be topicality arguments. They did not think they would actually win the debate on these arguments. They weren't good arguments, but they just were proud of themselves for reading more and more and more and more arguments. Those were time sucks to distract the other team, but they were never going to win the debate on those arguments. Okay, so I'm gonna move on now.
Wait, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So you said that like for theory, like you have to prove why something's like bad for like all debates. So,
Yes. So remember, this is a norm for all of debate. So you can't just say this is something that should only be disallowed in this debate. It has to be a norm that you should disallow this for every debate ever.
So like if you're running theory against like a K argument, wouldn't that be like really like difficult to win because it would say like you can never like you should never be able to run like a non-topical like K argument.
Well, yeah, if you are saying we should never be able to read critiques on the af or the neg, you now have to defend that every single critique on the af or the neg should not be allowed. And your opponent can, of course, get up and talk about all the good that reading critiques have done for debate, for making debate more inclusive, and also changing the way that non-Black, right, and other, you know, folks think about debates and think about the world around them. Okay, so we're going to go to the next slide. We're going to talk about what theory is not. It is not a tool to avoid other arguments. An example of this is if your opponent reads an argument that is good against you. You should not read theory just so you don't have to answer it. If they didn't actually do anything wrong and you are just reading theory so you can talk about something else, you've most likely read a very bad argument, and your judge is also likely not going to be persuaded, because everyone in the room, after 5 years of debate experience, knows when you are avoiding an argument. They know what a persuasive and a good argument sounds like. If you are just avoiding arguments, one, you should ask, why are you doing debate? And two, you should really think about if the argument you are making to avoid talking about your opponent's argument is really persuasive. It is probably not. Theory is not a way to avoid doing topic research. There have been debaters in the past that they read some really bad affirmative argument or some really bad negative argument, and in every single debate, they find something wrong that their opponent has done. They make things up. This is bad. It means that you didn't actually come to debate at all. You don't actually want to hear what your opponent has said. You really just want to make false accusations about them doing something that is bad. I don't support that, and I don't really, hang out with too many people that support that. It's lazy, it's intellectually dishonest, and you're accusing someone of doing something. You are disrespecting someone else's character, right? If you accuse them of doing something bad to debate, if they've not actually done anything wrong. Finally, there are some people, and these people tend to be young white boys. They come up with silly arguments. So Chris was talking before about how has theory affected what evidence we read. There have been theory arguments about what color highlighting you can use on your cards. There have been theory arguments about how you announce your cards. Can I say Wilderson in 10? They said, well, no, you need to say 2010. You can't highlight in yellow. You have to highlight in green. These are silly arguments that don't actually win big debates. There are ways to avoid a debate. And so these arguments have become more and more silly over time, and people try to come up with the worst version of theory arguments so that way they do not have to engage their opponents. All right, so I want everyone to take a second and write down one practice in debate that you would like to discourage. If you could read a theory argument, and we'll talk more about what a theory argument actually looks like in a second. If you could read a theory argument to discourage one practice in debate, what would it be?
Professor Smith,
Yes.
just as for me, do you think that certain kinds of frivolous theory arguments are social markers? What I mean by, do you think that,
Potentially, but if we could just give everyone a second to stop and jot, and we can talk about that in 1 second.
okay.
So for those who do know what a full theory argument looks like, I'm not asking you to come up with the full argument. So no one needs to worry about knowing all the parts of a theory argument. Right now, we're just writing down one practice we would like to discourage in debate.
Right, so both Alpha and Egg utilize theory, right?
So right now, David, all we're doing is writing down one practice in all of debate that we would like to discourage.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've had about a minute. Can I have a volunteer to talk about a practice they would like to discourage?
Reading too many offs. Like I would cap it off at like 8 offs.
Okay, but you definitely have just scared people, Sanaa. So Sanaa did policy debate last year, and so she's saying in a 2-hour debate that you should be limited to 8 off. In an LD debate, that number might go lower, or maybe not. Maybe even in LD, you are okay with 8 off. But just so people don't get, scared by the number. Okay, but that's a good example. Okay, can we get some more volunteers?
I don't like how you have to share your case to your opponent in the LD round before you start.
Okay, so we could potentially, try to find a way to not share our case. Why is it bad to share our case, Harris?
I mean, I feel like when they know all of our arguments and they know how to counter it, they could like easily defeat our points.
Okay, but do you feel like them being less prepared or less able to defeat your points is trying to avoid having a good debate?
No.
No. So do you think you have better debates when your opponent has less information?
Oh, okay. I see. I
Right.
yeah.
So, you could, of course, make, an argument, right, about any norms that you want. But we really want to make sure we're not avoiding arguments. We want to make sure we're engaging. Shay?
I have two that I'm not
Oh,
sure if this is right, but
okay.
condition
How
now.
how about just one, Shay?
Um, plan inclusive counter plans.
Okay. So plan inclusive counter plans. For those of you all who don't know what that means, right? So the affirmative, right, can read a plan of action. A plan is just an example of the resolution. So say, for example, the plan says the United States will enact a policy to get rid of all secondary sanctions. The negative could say get rid of all secondary sanctions except for secondary sanctions on actors that interact with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so the plan, inclusive counterplan, would include part of the AF, and they really want to test the idea of getting rid of all sanctions. So if we have questions about plan inclusive counterplans, we can answer those in a little bit. Maybe one more example.
I just said non-topical AFs.
Okay, so non-topical AFs. So David, what do you mean a non-topical AF?
Like AFs that don't defend any part of the resolution.
Okay, so maybe we want people to have to defend some part of the resolution or have some relationship to the resolution, which is a debate to be had, whether or not that is good or always necessary. Okay, so everyone has had great examples so far. And I believe Mr. Chris had a question.
I did. I wanted to know, in your professional opinion, did you think that certain frivolous theory arguments are associated with social markers, i.e., like, does the community mark like people who read particular kinds of frivolous arguments a particular way? And then what is the impact on that student's success after they are marked that way?
Well, I can tell you from personal experience that the kind of silly arguments I'm talking about, really only young white boys are allowed to get away with these things, right? Because they are seen as just kind of playing around, and it's neutral. I, at one point, read all the bad arguments, all the bad theory arguments, all the bad framework arguments. I read all the bad arguments, and people just did not receive me the same way. And so some people said, oh, it's not about race, it's about what school you go to, but there were people from all types of different schools. People also knew that my school was in an urban neighborhood. They said it's about what camp you go to, but there were people who went to all different types of debate camps. And so the real difference between them and me was that I was Black and that they were not. And so even if you don't think there's a one-to-one relationship between who's allowed and who's not allowed to do these types of things, I would look at which debaters have been successful reading silly theory arguments. The general trend, even if other people have tried, is that young white boys become successful when they try to read silly and frivolous arguments. Okay. Right now we're going to talk about what are the parts of a theory argument. So a theory argument has 4 parts. The first part of a theory argument is the interpretation. So everyone should write down the word interpretation. An interpretation is basically your circle. I draw the line at X. So you would say the AF should be required to do X, or they should not be allowed to do X, or the negative should be required to do X, or they should not be allowed to do X. Interpretations come in 2 kinds. The first is a requirement, right? You require something to be done. And they also come in prohibitions. The AF or the next should not be allowed to do this thing. And the way in which you word that matters for the way in which the argument is received and executed in the debate. Then there's a violation. The violation says how the other debater violates the norm that you've set out, how their norm is outside of the circle and where you have drawn the circle. Can anyone tell me what the difference might be between a prohibition and a requirement?
That a requirement is probably something that's already been done, like in the 1AC, or like a prohibition is like no, like any condo or uncondo, or like condo bad or something like that, to keep them from doing something later on in the debate. Well, like a requirement is something that they've already violated.
Okay. So I think I understand what you're saying. Does someone else have an idea?
I think like a requirement is just something that like you're supposed to do, but like they didn't do. And then prohibition is something that they did do, but you shouldn't be able to do. That you're arguing you shouldn't be able to do.
So this is more closely related to the language that I would use, but both David and Hannah are both getting to the right spot. So a prohibition says that a thing that has been done in the debate or that you think they're going to do in the debate should not be allowed, right? So maybe you know that they, in the 2NR, do something tricky a lot. You could make an argument in the 1ER and say they are not allowed to do this. A requirement is potentially sometimes a little bit harder because it says that they've done something and most of what they've done is like, okay, but they should have done it kind of stylistically different, usually. So these are just kind of rough generalizations. So maybe they disclosed their affirmative to you before the debate, but they only did it 15 minutes before the debate. You think they must do it 30 minutes before the debate. Right? Maybe they've read a counter plan in the debate, right? Which is just a different plan idea on the negative. You say they should not ever read counter plans on the negative. So this does matter for how things are perceived, really, and how we kind of measure, right, how bad the thing that they did was. But you should just keep in mind that prohibitions and requirements do kind of change the perception and the burden for you to prove. So the next thing we have is a standard. There are a couple of different standards, and we'll talk about what a standard means and then give some examples. So a standard is a way for us to measure whether or not your interpretation is actually good for debate. It is a way for us to try to quantify or qualify if you actually have a good norm. Have you drawn the circle in a good place? An example of a standard is ground. Right? And ground just really means, you know, what arguments can I enter in the debate that matter? So a counterplan might take away the affirmative ground. The resolution requires that the affirmative defend that the United States take an action. A counterplan that also has the United States take an action might reduce the uniqueness or the unique value that the affirmative gets from demanding that the US do something. And so, of course, the complexity of the counterplan and the parts of the counterplan can all change what that ground looks like. David talked about before affirmatives that don't really defend the resolution or are not connected to the resolution. If you want to read your hedge disad, but the affirmative has read an F that is about, you know, interpreting the resolution and talking about structural violence, but does not actually get rid of secondary sanctions, then your hedge disad probably does not link, and you have now maybe lost some ground. Finally, a theory argument includes a voting issue. There's two general types of voting issues. The first is education, and the second is fairness. Education means that your norm, if followed, would provide more education to everyone in debate. Maybe they learn better skills. Maybe they learn more in-depth analysis of the topic, but they learn more. Fairness means that if everyone follows your norm, that people would have a better chance in a debate of having a 50-50 shot at winning the ballot. So people who say something's unfair, they mean that the other team, the other debater, has taken away, right, some of their kind of percentage points, right, from their chance of winning. So maybe the other debater does something that reduces your chances of winning to 30%, right? Then you might want to call them out and say they've done something wrong, right? So in my interpretation, in my opinion, you should not read a theory argument unless your chances of winning the debate because of this bad practice are actually affected. This is what I mean. So unless maybe what your opponent did was not the 100% educational, but maybe it wasn't actually that bad, right? Just like some days your teacher just says, okay, today's a movie day. It's not the most educational, but it is okay, right? Maybe they just closed at 29 minutes before the debate started, and you think they should just close 30 minutes before the debate started. Could that 1 minute have helped? Maybe. At the end of the debate, would that 1 minute really have made the difference? Probably not. Okay, does anyone have a question about the parts of a theory argument?
Sorry, what are the standards again?
So there are different standards. The two that we just went over were first ground, and I feel like I don't remember the other one that I went over. Maybe someone else can help. Yeah, did I go over a different standard? Anyone?
I just remember you talking about grounds.
Okay, so ground was the example that I used.
How would like this shall a theory argument apply to like arguments like if the app were either use like a racial slur or something like that? Would that be like a theory argument you could make?
You probably would not want to make a theory argument. You probably would read some kind of critique of language.
Okay.
Why is can you put this interpretation and the standards next to each other and then have the violation and the voter?
I'm sure the judge would figure it out, but why would you change the order?
Because I feel like the standard would make more sense next to the interpretation, so you could explain everything about the interpretation, then go over the violation and the voter, which are about opponent.
Well, this has been done this way for many years and has been taught by many great people. So while I'm sure your judge could figure it out, if it ain't broke, I would not fix it. But you feel free, but I'm not encouraging you to try to change it because your judge will be used to this order. So maybe they'll figure it out, maybe they won't. But, people are allowed to experiment with arguments as they see fit.
Okay.
Okay, do we have maybe one more question? Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so we have a potential critique alternative. So I don't know if everyone knows a ton about critiques, but critiques generally allow the negative, kind of just like Hanan talked about. They generally bring up some philosophical or value-based issue that might not be 100% related to the plan. And so what it means to be related to the plan or the AF is up for debate, but they bring up some issue. In this debate, in this scenario, the negative, they've read a critique and they said, if you vote for me, all people in the world will become anti-racist. I would like everyone to take 1 minute to write down what might be bad or objectionable about this critique argument, really known as the alternative to the critique, the thing we should do instead of the affirmative. Okay, can we get a volunteer to maybe think about what is objectionable about this alternative?
It's not enough to just become anti-racist. We must abolish the systems that allow for racism to exist in the first place.
That might be a good kind of substantive response about why the alternative doesn't go far enough. But in terms of drawing a circle around arguments that should be allowed and arguments that should not be allowed, do you have an objection maybe to this argument?
They shouldn't have to enforce an idea upon everybody, or like debate arguments shouldn't be like so I don't know what the word is, but like forced upon everybody.
Okay, so we'll hold on to that. Shay?
I don't know, but it could be because the possibility of all people in the world becoming anti-racist is really unlikely, and it's going to be really hard to enforce, and it's probably not going to happen.
Okay, so Sanaa talked about the right should we do this, right? And Shay brings up can we do this? What they're both asking about is the ability or the right of the negative to demand and to just wave a magic wand and to affect all the billions of people on the earth. This is probably utopian, right? And so many critique alts are accused of being too utopian, right? They kind of just wave a magic wand and they say, poof, all of racism is solved. We know that the world has been dealing with this for hundreds of years, but you have fixed it. Thank you. What are some potential problems, or like in terms of the standards, what are some issues?
Proof testing?
Did someone say truth testing?
Yeah.
So truth testing is a paradigm about evaluating substance, right? And so we're not talking about substantive arguments, right? We're not talking about, which paradigm do we evaluate debate under, whether it's a policy paradigm or a truth testing paradigm. We're saying in terms of things like ground, right? What has happened in the debate, right? That maybe makes it uneducational or that decreases your chances of winning.
Because it makes you defend, like if they're saying, oh, we're anti-racist, it kind of might force you to like say anti-racism is bad. It's kind of a hard position to defend.
Well, so an affirmative could say that their advantage to the plan stops people from being racist. And so we don't want to say that debates about how to fix racism are bad, right? Maybe we should focus on the utopian aspect. So what are some reasons maybe that people cannot just wave a magic wand in a debate and make all of racism and the whole world go away?
Because then there's no like debate about like how we actually go about doing that. It's just like they just make it a debate about whether or not like something that's like everyone thinks is good, because then like you can't argue against it.
Okay, so one standard other than ground, right, is the idea that it is not real world. It's not realistic. In order to solve things, we have to know kind of step by step. Even if you don't have, right, every single step, you got to have a kind of a rough idea about how we're going to go about fixing things. Right? And then in terms of that, if we don't have that debate and you don't have to defend that, then that also affects your ground. Right? What arguments can you make against this? Right?
Could an argument be that it's not?
So hold on, Terrence. So the debate, the debate, I'm going to call you in 1 second. The debate is about the mechanism of how to solve racism. How do we fix it, right? We all agree that racism is bad, right? We come to debate to talk about how do we fix it. And so, for example, right, Afro-pessimism or certain people who are, critical legal scholars might have criticisms of the Civil Rights Act. They might have criticisms of BLM. And we can talk about what is the best strategy or the best path, right, to get rid of racism. But we can't have a debate over whether racism is good or bad. And the alternative basically just waves a wand and says, well, we're going to bypass all of that and everything is just going to be fixed. And I'm not going to tell you how, but it will be fixed. Okay, Terrence, what is your idea?
Could an argument be that it doesn't offer pragmatic solutions or like steps, and the fact that if you were to fix every problem with a utopian type of solution, then that essentially defeats the purpose of the debate space, because you would never have to actually debate. You could just say, okay, we'll just get rid of this ideology.
Yes, that's pretty similar to what I just said. And so if you can figure out maybe potentially something that's different from the kind of real world kind of standard or the realism standard, or if you can figure out something different from the ground standard. Does anyone else have maybe something outside of those? But that does show that you were taking good notes. So I'll add one more and then we can move on. So this is potentially very unpredictable. Most people there's no way to predict based on a resolution about secondary sanctions that the affirmative or the negative would completely get rid of racism, right? If you notice, the picture that I've added is the Ku Klux Klan, right? How could you predict that we are going to have a debate over them going from David Duke to Martin Luther King in less than 10 seconds? Who would have predicted that? Can everyone give me a reaction with the hand clap if you would not have predicted that you would turn someone from David Duke to Malcolm X in less than 10 seconds? Okay, Mr. Randall, what time is this over?
I'm sorry, what was your question, Mrs. Smith?
What time is this elective over?
I'm about to tell you. I believe this elective is over at 1:50.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So that is, yeah. So
yes, yep, I got it. Yep, we're good. We're good. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna go to the next slide. All right, so I would like you to now consider this. So we talked a little bit about what a counterplan is. So the affirmative reads the Camp Af, right, about dollar hegemony and alliances, or really any Af. The negative reads a counterplan that says the U.S. should get rid of all secondary sanctions, except for secondary sanctions on Dennis Rodman for financial and material support of North Korea. Does anyone know who Dennis Rodman is?
Basketball player.
He is a basketball player. Does anyone know who the young Asian man is? Well, middle-aged at this point. The middle-aged Asian man in the picture. Yes, Shay.
Kim Jong-un.
Yes, he is Kim Jong-un. And so this basketball player from America is friends with Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea. And so the counterplan gets rid of every single secondary sanction on everyone, every company, every country on earth, except for Dennis Rodman, because when he goes to North Korea, he brings gifts to Kim Jong-un, and he pays money to get there to North Korean airlines. And so we say, you are materially and financially supporting North Korea, you should be sanctioned. Does anyone, so let's take a second and consider this and what might be problematic, right? Remember the standards. We're not asking about why this would not solve. We're not asking about answers to the counterplans. We're talking about standards and why this would be a bad norm for debate, that we have to debate this counterplan. Right, so standards we've talked about so far were predictability, right? Kind of a pragmatism or real world standard. We've talked about ground. So there are other standards out there.
So like, wait, wasn't one of them like, didn't you already like talk about this? Or it was like significance or something?
Significance is a stock issue. It is not part of theory debate. But if you try to talk about or think through what significance as a stock issue is trying to get at, it can help you understand.
Like, is it like something called like just desserts or something? Like you're doing the plan, but like you like do something really little, and like you can't really argue against something that like barely does anything else besides like what you're already doing.
So it's very, very tiny. It's very, very tiny, right? And so maybe it is not good to have the AF defend these very, 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 very tiny counterplans, right? So the AF gets rid of 100% of secondary sanctions. The counterplan gets rid of 99.999% of secondary sanctions, with the exception of this one very pierced basketball player. Right? And so not only is that probably unpredictable, has anyone found any literature about any cards about secondary sanctions on Dennis Rodman?
No.
Probably not, no.
Probably not. And so another way to think about this is in terms of the literature, right? A standard is about, you can talk about literature. So the literature does not talk about this. And so the negative probably needs someone in the literature that says this is a good idea for it to be predictable. Right? And we should use the literature as a litmus test on whether or not something is good or bad for debate. The negative should not be able to come up with any counterplan on any person, anywhere on the planet. How many people then could the negative, get picks about? How about Caleb? Caleb, if the negative had access to counterplans about individual people, how many counterplans does the negative now have access to?
I mean, there's like, well, I wouldn't say infinite, but like thousands.
I think a little bit higher than thousands. Can someone tell me, so you're on the right track, how many counterplans does the negative have access to? If we can sanction individual people on the earth.
7 billion people on the earth.
What'd you say, Hannah?
The 7 billion.
Oh, sorry,
on earth.
Hannah.
The 7 billion people on earth.
There are billions. So if you can find one way that their interactions with the economy has somehow interacts with North Korea, then you have access to billions of people. The people who are famous enough or in part of corporations, right, that interact with North Korea probably is closer to the thousands. But just on itself, right, drawing a circle about picking out individual people it's probably bad to have arguments, whether on the af or the negative, about individuals, because, right, in terms of any argument about individuals, there's billions of people. In terms of arguments about North Korea, there's probably thousands of people. This is way too many arguments, and the affirmative can probably not prepare for all of that. You can't research, right, about, you know, Dennis Rodman's relationship to North Korea. You can find some pictures and figure out what they like to do when they're in front of the media, but there's no research on their relationship.
So is literature-based a standard?
Yes, literature is a standard. It is a litmus test for whether or not something should be allowed. So we talked about predictability, and we talked about kind of how the numbers affect how predictable or unpredictable something is. We talked about how there's no grounding against this counter plan, right? Because there's no research that you can do to respond to it. We can also talk about why it is a distraction, right, from the core debate about whether sanctions are good or bad, right? And so debating a counterplan that is so tiny, right, can skew the debate, right, away from the topic literature, right? So it shifts the focus from secondary sanctions onto Dennis Rodman. That would be a very bad debate. If every debate was about Dennis Rodman, these would be very bad debates. Does anyone else have maybe one last thought on the Dennis Rodman North Korea counterplan?
If you were the affirmative and you had to debate a counterplan about Dennis Rodman, which is very tiny, it would probably skew like how you would approach the debate for the rest of the round, because now you have to know who Dennis Rodman is, like how does this even function, and it would probably skew your strategy or how you like use your time in your speeches.
Right. So now you just brought up some other standards. So we have time skew. We have strategy skew. So think of the disproportionate amount of time that the 1AR has to spend to answer this argument versus the amount of time that the 1NC has to use to put this argument out. Since there's no literature on this, they just have to read the sentence that you see in front of you. How long does this take to read, David?
Like 10 seconds, 5 seconds, I don't know.
How long would it take to answer?
Like a couple minutes, like a minute.
It's gonna take you more than a minute, because you have to figure out how to actually engage with the content of Dennis Rodman. Right? Remember, they don't have to read any cards because there are no cards, but you now have to talk about secondary sanctions, right? And how there can't be any exceptions to the plan. And you got to talk about permutations, and you've got to talk about the net benefit, and you got to talk about, right, the norms that you create in terms of the US. You got to talk about solvency. You got to do a lot of stuff. So, but the time trade-off, even for 1 minute, that is a large time trade-off that skews the amount of time that people have to invest in the debate. So we are now going to move on.
So is that how you, like you said, like if you run like frivolous, like if you run like, or like if someone runs like something frivolous like this, you can like, if like they run it as a time skew, you can like turn it against them by like.
Yes. So if you read a theory argument and someone that is silly, your opponent is going to make an argument that is called a reverse voting issue. And so they are going to, much like the accusation of reverse discrimination or reverse racism, they are going to say, well, you are the one who has wasted my time. And so because you put this out, now you should lose because you have skewed my time because I had to answer it. Does that make sense?
So you said the person that made the like the silly argument would try to say that.
So your opponent, right? So if they're putting out silly arguments, you know how to respond, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you are going to read your counter interpretation, right, and your standards and your other arguments, right? They are now going to say, well, the way that you debated has now wasted my time,
Okay.
right? So, for example, Hannah said that we could read theory as a time suck, right? So your opponent is now going to get up and say, well, you only spent 10 seconds putting out this theory argument, right? And now I'm going to spend 1 minute having to answer it. This causes a time skew, right? So I wanted to wait until we talk about time skew, right, to talk about RVIs. That's one way. Now they can also, right, in terms of you and how you responded, they can also, if they, let's say they made the bad theory argument, the way you respond, they can now make a theoretical objection to the way you responded and say that the way you responded is bad and it wastes their time. Because remember, they like to have silly debates. So now they will they've made a theory argument that was bad. You responded. And so now they can make a silly argument in response. So silly arguments can always turn into more and more and more silly arguments. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So just to recap, an RVI, right, is about saying that, much like reverse discrimination, I will say that the other person that is reading, that initiated the theory debate, is actually the one who's at fault, right, for skewing time. So if you put something out for a time suck, your opponent can beat the argument and then say you should lose for initiating this debate and wasting their time. Another way this can come back to bite you is, and often this is called meta theory, which is just other theory arguments, right? And so they will read theory about the way in which you responded to theory, or your lack of response to theory, or the standards that you read on theory. So it is always better to minimize, right, the amount of silliness in any given debate. Okay, so let's have a quick recap. So we're going to go over some more examples and a little bit quicker. Does anyone have any questions about anything that we've gone over so far? Oh. No one has any questions. How about we all take a minute to stop and jot? Everyone should write down something that they don't quite understand or something they have a question about. Okay, Raza, do you have a question?
I don't think so.
Okay. Ali? Ali? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no from Ali. Okay, we're going to move on. Okay, so let's consider this scenario in front of us. The affirmative has read two advantages / contention. Some of you guys might call them contentions. Some more progressive people call them advantages. The first advantage is dollar hegemony. The second advantage is alliances. The negative reads 7 minutes of turns against the alliances argument. The 1AR says they will no longer defend the part of their plan or their AF that causes them to solve the alliance's advantage. All the turns against the alliance's argument goes away. What are problems with this? What are things we can object to?
Can it be the part where they had stated their plan then as soon as it was responded to, they just say, okay, we're gonna get rid of that now. So there
Sure,
goes your 7 minutes.
sure. What are you objecting to? So we know the scenario. We know what happened. What is your objection?
Is it predictability?
Okay, so you can say that this is unpredictable, right? They've started the debate with their plan. You would not think that they would get rid of part of it. Okay, Shay.
Well, I would say that the objection would be the affirmative ability to kick a section of their AF after the negative has used up their time.
Okay, what is the problem with that? So that is the scenario. We are trying to say that that is bad. What is your objection? What's the standard? What's the reason why it is bad?
Well,
So how about you hold off for 1 second? We're gonna call on Emma, and if you can think of a way to articulate your thoughts, we can come back to you. Emma?
It skews like the negatives time because they just wasted 7 minutes answering a part of the affirmative that no longer exists.
There's a huge time skew, right? You look at the scenario, the negative spent 7 minutes, right? How long is the negative speech, Emma?
It's 13 minutes in total, but
So
it's
the first negative speech.
oh, it's 7 minutes.
Okay. So 100% of their time now no longer matters in the debate. So good argument. David?
So like the objection would be that like if they read it in the round, then that means like that they have to defend it because that's what they made a speech on in the middle of the round. So they can't just, so if you make turns against it, that means
So
even
I think we all agree with you implicitly. None of us would want to be negative against an AF that gets rid of their AF. But we're asking why they should not be allowed to do that.
because
Right? Why is this objectionable? So a rule is just, or a norm, our interpretation is just what we think should happen. The standards explain why we have a good norm, why we have a good circle, why this should be excluded from the circle. So we need you to explain why.
yeah, I would just say it would just it would create a huge time skew. And
Okay, so we have a two for time skew. So we have that this is unpredictable, that it causes a huge time skew. How about ground? Right? So remember, there wasn't just a time skew in terms of investment. If the negative spent 7 minutes and all of their ground from the 1NC was against this alliance's advantage, now they lost 100% of all of their ground in the entire debate. They didn't read any other arguments except these turns because they knew they had awesome turns, that they outweighed the case. Now, all this has gone away. So it's unpredictable, right? It is, we can also say that it's not educational, right? We can say that it's uneducational for the advocacy to shift in the middle of the debate, right? So affirmatives need to learn how to pick good advocacies, do good research on their advocacies, and to defend them throughout an entire debate. And we can talk about why defending something for an entire debate and going back and fixing it later, right, and trying to answer your opponent's arguments make for a good educational model, right? When you can just get rid of part of your affirmative, like we talked about earlier, you can avoid argument engagement. And so it is less engaging. It makes for a worse debate because it is not educational. It's not predictable. It causes time skew and it causes ground loss. So of course we could think of other arguments if we spend a lot of time here, but hopefully everyone gets the idea about how we can describe this as a bad situation. So we have an example related to what was brought up earlier in terms of what happens if your opponent uses a racial slur. So Hana asked, should I read a theory argument? And I said, no, you should read a critique that says you should vote against them for their language. Is there something objectionable about this critique? What theory argument could we read here? So everyone should take a few seconds to stop and jot down their ideas. What theory arguments could we read here? So Hana has now made an argument in the debate. Instead of a theory argument, she read a critique. What theory arguments could we read against this argument? What persuasive arguments could we make here?
It moots the 1AC, like the good parts of it, and it shifts the debate.
So you could say that. Is that a super persuasive argument, though, after they've used a racial slur?
Not really.
Not really. Well, you could say that, language, should be interpreted, and affect your speaker points. That it isn't a huge deal. There's evidence that says that language doesn't matter. But you just used a racial slur. Maybe someone else has a better idea. Harris? Harris?
Did you say Harris or Terrence?
I said Harris.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to assume that Harris is no longer there. Caleb, what is your possible objection to this argument?
I'm not really sure, because I feel like this is the type of argument that I'd try to make.
Okay, David?
I mean, it depends on it might depend on what the context is. Like maybe you could argue, if your evidence said it and it was made to be impactful, maybe
So what is the theoretical objection here, David?
Theoretical.
Right, remember we're talking about theory. So in terms of theory, in terms of standards or interpretation, what is there a theory argument that is persuasive? Right now you're trying to answer the critique. We're not answering the critique right now. We are answering the theory argument.
Yeah, I don't
or
know.
making a theory argument. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
Okay, so the reason why you all are having such a hard time is because it is very hard to come up with a persuasive argument against this, because you have said something racist. So 2 life lessons. One is that you do need to engage with this critique, and there are ways for you to try to engage, and that is what David was talking about. But it's very hard if you said something racist. Second thing is that when you try to force theory arguments, this is where we come up with silly or frivolous theory arguments, right? This is where you probably need to have a real conversation, right, about language, about the plan, about how should people be punished for language? Is there a middle ground about language? You probably need to engage. You probably should not disengage and say, it's bad that they called me out for saying something racist. Okay, next. We're talking about the Alliances app again. The negative reads a counterplan against an Alliances app. The counterplan says we should increase diplomatic, military, and scientific exchanges with our allies to strengthen our alliances. Is there a persuasive theoretical objection to this counterplan?
It's just the app with a different method. So it's the app might have to contradict itself because it's an alliance app. It might contradict itself just because they use a different method.
Well, the app fixes alliances by getting rid of secondary sanctions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the counterplan is trying to fix alliances a different way. So this counterplan does not get rid of secondary sanction. It leaves secondary sanctions. And it says there's a different way to fix our alliances. Emma?
Well, I mean, I don't really think there's a persuasive theoretical argument here because you're directly, well, maybe, since you're leaving secondary sanctions as the negative, you're still directly clashing with the affirmative. You're just also solving for one of their advantages, but it's still fair game because you're still dealing with the topic. You're still talking about secondary sanctions, and it's not bad to read a counterplan necessarily.
Okay. So I think you're right. I think, if you really think that counterplans are bad, then maybe read an argument, because they would use the United States. They would technically steal the actor of the affirmative. And you can say that only the AF gets to use the United States. They can use Canada or they can use China or any other person, but they don't get to take the same actor. That isn't a super persuasive argument, but under the right circumstances, it could be persuasive. But in most circumstances, this counterplan does not seem very bad. It hasn't really done anything wrong. It just says we should take an action, different action. And so 9 times out of 10, I would not think that you would win a theory debate against this counterplan. Okay, let's consider this. The 1AR spends 3 minutes making offensive arguments against a negative counterplan. The AF firmly wins that the counterplan is bad and will win the debate if they basically give a 2AR. The 1AR spent 1 minute answering the turns on case. The 2NR gets up, they say they're not going to defend the counterplan, and they spend the next 5 minutes and 30 seconds extending and weighing case turns against the AF. The 2AR is now in a tight spot. They have to use 3 minutes to explain how their 1 minute of 1AR answers should overcome the 5 minutes and 30 seconds spent on the case in the 2NR. Why might the fact that the negative got rid of the counterplan be objectionable? The counterplan was conditional. What might be objectionable about this? Emma?
You're removing clash, if that makes sense, by getting rid of your counterplan by kicking it because it has all these arguments against it. You're not only getting rid of part of your material that you are debating about, but you're also limiting your opponent's ability to clash because they have less material to go up against, and they've also wasted a lot of their time going up this material that now no longer exists in the debate round.
Okay, so we see that conditionality potentially causes time skew, causes ground skew, right? It might cause, the affirmative to skew their strategy, right? They spent so much time in the 1AR on this counterplan because they thought they could use that offense in their 2AR. So we talked about strategy, we talked about time, we talked about ground, right? Potentially, maybe it's predictable, maybe not, right? But we can potentially say that a counterplan that is conditional might not be so great. There are objections. Now, these might not be the best objections, but conditionality is a very common debate that you will see a lot. Okay, so one last example. The affirmative reads the Kemp AF. The negative reads Afro-pessimism, which says the state is bad, that trying to change things is bad, and the idea of progress is bad. And they read a dissat that says that hedge is bad. Oh no, sorry, I'm misreading. I took my glasses off. So Afro-pessimism says hedge is bad, right? It says the AF is bad. The negative then also reads a counterplan that tries to solve for hedge. So on one piece of paper, they've said hedge is bad. And on the other piece of paper, they've said the hedge is good. They said that both of these things are conditional, and whichever argument you answer the worst, they will extend in the 2NR. What is potentially objectionable about this setup?
It's like perfcon, it's contradictory.
Okay, so it's contradictory, right? Because these things turn each other. You can't both say hedge is good and hedge is bad. All right. You would then need to explain why it is bad for the app to debate contradictory arguments. But yeah, we could point out that they're contradictory.
Could I also say that because they're contradictory, there's no real clash, or the app doesn't know which way to respond. So either way, then they could be like, okay, you responded to this, but not the other one. Yeah, so it makes it really hard for the app to respond because they don't know which one to actually attack and which one is actually a part of their case.
So you can take that a step further. So it's not that the app doesn't know which one to attack. It's that if the affirmative puts out its best answers, right, about like why hedge is good, right, why the app is the best way to solve hedge, the negative can say, well, look, the affirmative gave me a link argument and they proved that they are the best way to stabilize the most hedge. And so it proves the link argument on the other flow, right? In the other direction, if the affirmative says that they get rid of racism, that they start to deconstruct the United States, then the negative debater can just say, well, look, they proved that they start to deconstruct the United States. They tried to turn this racism argument, they tried to turn this Afro-pessimism argument. In order to turn this, they have to start to get rid of hedge, which means the counterplan is better because it is a better way to solve hedge. And so it's not that you don't know which one to answer, it's that contradictory arguments in the debate mean that your best offense can be used against you on the other flow. And so it discourages the app from using their best arguments and creates a huge strategy skew in the debate. It also causes a slight time skew, not a huge one, but a slight one. But because whichever one that you spend less time on, right, they are likely going to go for it.
Mr. Smith, you are officially 2 minutes over, just so you know.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any last questions? This is the last example. Does anyone have a burning question? All right, so thank you all for coming to the Introduction to Theory. I hope everyone learned about the basics of a theory argument and how to articulate their objections to theory arguments in debate. Everyone should enjoy their lunch break.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.